There is a specific and remarkable thing that happens when human beings gather in a location where a limited resource is being distributed, one person at a time. They form a line. Not because anyone tells them to, not because there is a physical barrier compelling them to, but because something in the collective psychology of the assembled group produces, almost automatically, an orderly sequential arrangement in which each person waits their turn according to an implicit and almost universally respected principle. First come, first served. Cut in front of that line, and you will discover just how seriously this apparently arbitrary social convention is taken. The reaction will not be mild. It will often be immediate, disproportionate, and charged with a species of moral outrage that seems wildly out of scale with the actual stakes involved, which are typically nothing more than being served a few minutes later than one otherwise would have been. This is strange when you examine it closely. The queue is not a law. In most contexts, it is not formally enforced by any authority. It is a spontaneously emerging social order, produced and policed entirely by the participants themselves, and yet it operates with a consistency and a moral force that rivals many formal legal institutions. Understanding why human beings queue, why they enforce queuing norms so vigorously, and what queuing reveals about the deeper structure of human fairness psychology turns out to open up one of the most illuminating windows available into how human beings collectively solve one of the oldest and most consequential problems in social life: how to allocate a scarce resource among multiple people who all want it. Let's begin with the basic anthropology and history of queuing as a social practice. The historian Joe Moran at Liverpool John Moores University, who has written extensively on the cultural history of waiting and queuing, has documented that while informal waiting for access to scarce resources has almost certainly existed throughout human history, the formalized queue as a widely recognized and culturally elaborated social institution appears to be a relatively recent development, becoming increasingly prominent and increasingly formalized, particularly in industrializing societies from the 18th century onward. As urbanization brought together large numbers of strangers competing for access to shared resources, including transportation, retail goods, and public services, in contexts where the traditional small-scale social mechanisms for allocating access, which typically relied on people knowing each other and negotiating access through personal relationship and social status, could no longer function. Moran's historical research documents that the queue, as a widely recognized cultural institution, solved a specific and pressing social problem created by urban modernity. How can a large group of complete strangers, with no pre-existing social relationships or status hierarchy to draw upon, fairly and efficiently allocate access to a scarce resource without requiring violence, negotiation, or the intervention of an external authority for every single transaction? The queue provided an elegant solution, a simple, easily understood rule: first arrival determines priority, that requires no negotiation, no assessment of relative status or need, and no external enforcement beyond the willingness of the queue's own participants to collectively maintain and defend the order they have created. This last point, that queues are largely self-policing, is one of the most psychologically interesting features of the phenomenon and has become a significant object of study in social psychology. The psychologist Stanley Milgram, whose research on obedience we examined in an earlier video in this series, also conducted a lesser-known but fascinating study specifically on queue-cutting behavior, published in 1986. Milgram and his colleagues had experimental Confederates attempt to cut into real queues in New York City, observing and recording the reactions of the people whose position in line was being violated. Milgram's research found that direct verbal objection to queue cutting was less common than might be expected, occurring in only about a quarter of observed incidents, but that queue cutting reliably produced visible signs of distress, discomfort, and disapproval, even when this disapproval was not verbally expressed, including hostile stares, muttering, and visible postural changes indicating tension and disapproval. Milgram also found that the closer the queue cutter positioned themselves to a specific individual, the more likely that individual was to object, suggesting that the psychological harm of queue violation is experienced most acutely by the people whose specific position is most directly usurped, rather than being experienced uniformly by everyone in the line. What makes Milgram's findings particularly significant is what they reveal about the specific psychological mechanism underlying queue enforcement. It appears to function as what social psychologists call a form of decentralized norm enforcement, a social order maintained not by any centralized authority, but by the willingness of ordinary individuals to bear some personal cost, in the form of social discomfort or occasionally direct confrontation, to defend a shared rule from which they personally benefit and from which they perceive a moral obligation to protect others. The psychologist and behavioral economist Ernst Fehr at the University of Zurich has developed an influential theoretical framework for understanding this kind of behavior, which he calls strong reciprocity, the human tendency to enforce cooperative social norms even at significant personal cost, and even in situations where the individual enforcing the norm receives no direct personal benefit from doing so. Fehr's experimental research using economic games has documented that human beings show a robust and cross-culturally consistent willingness to punish norm violators, a behavior Fehr calls altruistic punishment, even when punishing the violator is personally costly and produces no direct material benefit to the punisher. Fehr's research proposes an evolutionary account of why this behavior exists. In the ancestral environment, human survival depended critically on the maintenance of cooperative social norms within small groups, and individuals who were willing to bear personal costs to enforce these norms, punishing free riders and norm violators even when doing so provided no direct personal benefit, contributed to the maintenance of group-level cooperation that benefited everyone in the group, including the enforcer. Groups containing a sufficient number of individuals willing to engage in this costly enforcement behavior would have outcompeted groups lacking such individuals, because cooperative norms without effective enforcement mechanisms tend to collapse under the pressure of free riding. Q enforcement, on this account, is a specific contemporary manifestation of a much more general and much more ancient psychological system for maintaining cooperative social order, one that evolved to handle the allocation of resources like food and access to mates within small ancestral groups, and that has been extended, in the modern world, to handle the allocation of far more mundane resources like access to a checkout counter or a boarding gate. The developmental psychologist Katherine Kinzler at the University of Chicago has documented that a rudimentary sense of fairness related to turn-taking and sequential access emerges remarkably early in human development, with infants as young as 15 months showing measurable surprise, as indexed by increased looking time in controlled experimental paradigms when they observe violations of expected turn-taking or resource allocation norms in simple scenarios involving puppets or animated characters. This finding suggests that the psychological foundations of cue-related fairness intuitions are not something children must be laboriously taught through years of explicit socialization, but are present in at least rudimentary form, very early in cognitive development, consistent with the broader evolutionary account that this represents an ancient and deeply conserved psychological system rather than a purely learned cultural convention. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm, whose research on egalitarianism in hunter-gatherer societies we examined in an earlier video in this series, has documented that the specific first-come, first-served principle underlying modern cue behavior connects to a broader and evolutionarily much older pattern of egalitarian resource allocation norms that Boehm found to be nearly universal across contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. Boehm's ethnographic research found that hunter-gatherer societies typically maintained strong cultural norms against the monopolization of resources by any single individual or subgroup, enforced through mechanisms including gossip, ridicule, ostracism, and in extreme cases, physical punishment or expulsion from the group, directed specifically at individuals who attempt to claim disproportionate access to shared resources. Boehm's research suggests that the modern cue, with its strict first-come, first-served allocation rule and its decentralized, socially enforced compliance mechanism, may represent a specific contemporary expression of this much older and more general egalitarian resource allocation psychology, one that evolved specifically to prevent the kind of resource monopolization by high-status or physically dominant individuals that would have been destabilizing to cooperation in small, interdependent ancestral groups. The social psychologist Norman Miller has conducted research specifically examining the intensity of emotional reactions to cue violations and has documented what he describes as a puzzling asymmetry. The emotional intensity of reactions to cue cutting appears substantially disproportionate to the actual material cost involved, which is typically limited to a delay of a few minutes at most. Miller's research proposes that this disproportion is best explained not by the actual time cost involved, but by what the queue violation symbolically represents, a unilateral claim, by the queue cutter, that their time and their needs are more important than the time and needs of everyone else who is waiting, an implicit assertion of superior status and entitlement that violates the fundamental egalitarian premise on which the queue's legitimacy rests. This symbolic interpretation helps explain why queue cutting produces reactions that seem, on a purely economic calculation of time lost, wildly disproportionate. What is actually being violated is not simply a practical arrangement for efficient resource allocation, but a moral claim about equal worth and equal entitlement among strangers who have no other basis for establishing their relative claims to a scarce resource. The queue functions as a kind of continuously enacted moral statement. Everyone here is equally entitled to be served in the order they arrived, regardless of their wealth, status, appearance, or any other characteristic that might, in a different social context, be used to justify unequal treatment. There is a further dimension of queuing psychology that deserves careful attention, because it addresses a question that pure fairness psychology does not fully explain: why the subjective experience of waiting in a queue is so consistently and so intensely unpleasant, often disproportionately, so relative to the objective duration of the wait itself. The operations researcher and psychologist David Maister, whose influential work on what he calls the psychology of waiting lines has been foundational in the applied study of queue management, proposed a set of principles documenting that the subjective unpleasantness of waiting is determined by factors that have little to do with the objective clock time involved and a great deal to do with the psychological experience of that time. Maister's research found that unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time, that anxious waiting feels longer than relaxed waiting, that uncertain waits feel longer than known, finite waits, and that unexplained waits feel longer than explained waits. This finding has significant practical implications that have been extensively applied in service industry design, but it also reveals something important about the underlying psychology of queuing. Much of the distress associated with waiting in line is not simply about the objective time cost involved, but about the psychological experience of uncertainty and lack of control that waiting typically involves. A person standing in an unmoving line, with no visible progress and no information about how long the wait will last, experiences a fundamentally different psychological state than a person who can see the line moving steadily and who has a reasonably accurate estimate of how much longer they will need to wait, even if the objective wait time turns out to be identical in both cases. Maister's research connects to a broader body of work in psychology on what researchers call perceived control, the subjective sense that one has some ability to influence or predict the outcomes one is experiencing. The psychologist Ellen Langer at Harvard University has conducted extensive research documenting that even the illusion of control, without any actual increase in genuine influence over outcomes, can substantially reduce the psychological distress associated with uncertain or aversive situations. This research helps explain why queue management systems that provide visible information about wait times, numbered ticket systems that allow people to track their position without needing to physically remain in a fixed line, and other mechanisms that increase the queuing individual's sense of predictability and control tend to produce substantially higher satisfaction ratings even when they do not reduce the actual average waiting time experienced. The psychologist Richard Larson at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose research on queuing theory bridges mathematical operations research and behavioral psychology, has documented a further psychologically significant phenomenon he calls the social justice of queuing, examining how people's satisfaction with a queuing experience depends heavily on their perception of whether the queue is being fairly managed according to the first-come, first-served principle, independent of the objective wait time involved. Larson's research found that people report significantly higher satisfaction with objectively longer waits that are perceived as fairly managed than with objectively shorter waits that involve any perceived violation of the first-come, first-served principle, such as another customer being served out of turn, or a queue splitting unfairly into multiple lines with unequal progress rates. This finding reinforces the broader argument that queuing behavior and queuing satisfaction are governed primarily by fairness psychology rather than by pure economic calculation of time cost, and it has produced significant practical innovations in queue management, most notably the now widespread adoption of the single serpentine line feeding multiple service points, a design that has become standard in banks, airports, and many retail environments, specifically because it eliminates the perceived unfairness that arises when multiple separate lines progress at different rates, a situation in which a person who arrived earlier than another customer may nonetheless end up being served later, directly violating the first-come, first-served principle that underlies the entire psychological legitimacy of queue-based resource allocation. Larson has documented that the shift from multiple separate lines to a single serpentine queue feeding multiple servers, even when it does not change the average wait time experienced by the overall population, produces substantial and measurable increases in reported satisfaction, precisely because it eliminates the possibility of the specific fairness violation that people find most psychologically distressing, watching someone who arrived after you get served before you. This connects to a broader body of research on what behavioral economists and social psychologists call fairness heuristics, simple decision rules that human beings apply to judge whether a given allocation of resources or opportunities is fair, independent of the specific outcomes involved. The behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, working with Jack Knecht and Richard Thaler, conducted extensive research documenting that human beings possess robust and largely universal intuitions about what constitutes fair versus unfair economic behavior, intuitions that operate largely independently of formal economic reasoning about efficiency or overall welfare maximization, and that people are willing to incur real economic costs to punish behavior they perceive as violating these fairness norms, even in anonymous, one-shot economic interactions with no possibility of future reciprocity or reputational consequence. There is one further dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses an important cross-cultural question, whether the specific first-come, first-served norm that dominates queuing behavior in many Western societies is a genuine human universal or a culturally specific expression of a more general and more variable fairness psychology. The cross-cultural psychologist Michele Gelfand at the University of Maryland, whose extensive research on cultural variation in social norm strength has been influential in cross-cultural psychology, has documented that while some form of orderly resource allocation appears to be a human universal, the specific rules governing that allocation and the strictness with which those rules are enforced vary considerably across cultures. Gelfand's research on what she calls tight versus loose cultures, distinguishing societies with strong, strictly enforced social norms from societies with more flexible and loosely enforced norms, has found that queue discipline specifically varies in ways that correlate with this broader cultural dimension, with tight cultures, including many East Asian and Middle Eastern societies, showing stricter and more consistently enforced queuing behavior than loose cultures. Gelfand's research also documented that societal-level factors including historical exposure to environmental and social threats, including disease outbreaks, resource scarcity, and population density, predict the tightness or looseness of a culture's social norms more broadly, including queuing norms specifically, suggesting that the strictness of queue discipline in a given society may reflect deeper adaptive responses to that society's historical experience of resource scarcity and the corresponding importance of reliable, strictly enforced cooperative norms for managing competition over limited resources. The anthropologist Alex Massoudi at the University of Exeter has documented additional cross-cultural variation, specifically in the alternative allocation systems that emerge in societies or contexts where strict first-come, first-served queuing does not dominate, including systems based on need, status, negotiation, or various forms of lottery or random allocation. Massoudi's comparative research suggests that first-come, first-served queuing, while extremely widespread, represents one solution among several possible solutions to the general problem of allocating scarce resources fairly among multiple claimants, and that the specific solution a given society adopts likely reflects a combination of that society's particular history, its typical group sizes, and the specific character of the resources being allocated, with the first-come, first-served principle being particularly well-suited to contexts involving large numbers of anonymous strangers with no pre-existing social relationship or status hierarchy to draw upon. Exactly the urban modern context in which Joe Moran's historical research found the formalized queue first became a widely recognized cultural institution. What emerges from this body of research is a picture of the queue not as a trivial or arbitrary social convention, but as one of the most visible and most consistently enforced expressions of a deep and evolutionarily ancient human commitment to a specific conception of fairness. The idea that access to scarce and desired resources should be allocated according to a simple, transparent, and impartial rule that applies equally to everyone, regardless of their status, wealth, or personal characteristics, and that violations of this rule warrant a vigorous collective response even when the material stakes involved are genuinely trivial. The line you stood in today, waiting your turn for something as mundane as a cup of coffee or a boarding pass, was not simply an efficient mechanism for organizing access to a limited resource. It was a small, continuously reenacted assertion of one of the oldest moral commitments in human social life, that your claim to what you are waiting for is exactly as legitimate as everyone else's, that no one's time is inherently more valuable than anyone else's, and that the only fair basis for determining who goes first is the simplest and most impartial one available. You got here before they did. That should be enough. And the fact that it usually is, that a group of complete strangers, with no formal authority over each other, can spontaneously produce and vigorously defend this arrangement without anyone needing to enforce it from above, is one of the quieter but more remarkable achievements of human social cooperation. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.